Erev Tov, everyone. In the process of counting the Jewish people, as we see in this week's parsha, the Torah tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu was assisted by the heads of the 12 tribes of the Jewish people. And the Torah proceeds to name them. So the question arises that the Mefarshim look at, how did they become the heads of the tribes? What process, if any, was used to choose them? And if we know what the process was, is this something that we should emulate always in choosing our leaders, both spiritual and temporal? So regarding this issue, there are different streams of thought, as you can well imagine. One idea that many Mefarshim point to is that these people, so to speak, were hereditary leaders, and that the leadership of the tribe passed in a hereditary fashion. In other words, Reuven, when Reuven passed away, his oldest son became the head of the tribe. And that's how it continued onwards throughout the generations. And that would be for all the tribes. The Mefarshim point out that there are many difficulties in this. It certainly is a simpler, perhaps cleaner method of arriving at leadership, but it's not necessarily the best one. You could have that the second son or the third son far more capable, far better. So therefore, there are those that say, Rashi follows this idea, that those that were the Shotrim, the police force, so to speak, of the Jewish people when they were in Mitzrayim, they were the leadership class. And when the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, they graduated to become the leaders of the tribes. To a certain extent, this begs the question, how did they become the Shotrim? So there, it seems that the Mefarshim see that somehow Paro chose them. The Egyptians chose them. And that therefore, when they came into the desert now, when they were freed from Egypt, but nevertheless was natural, the first Rashi points out, that they would accept orders from those whom they accepted orders from earlier. And they had a merit, they had a schus, that when Paro said that they should throw the children into the river, they did not follow his orders. And that because of that, they themselves were physically beaten and abused by the Egyptian taskmasters. So in the schus of that, the blows that they absorbed in not listening to Paro, they were merited becoming the leaders of the Jewish people in the desert. And that's how these 12 men arrived. So one is hereditary and one is not necessarily hereditary, but it is chosen by authorities, by Paro, etc. There's a third stream represented by Rishonim. In the Torah, we have a rule, Achrei Rabim Lahatos. We follow the majority. That is a rule in the Sanhedrin. It's a rule in Halakha. So there are Meforshim who say that that's a rule in Jewish society as well, that we follow the majority. Now it says, Lo siyeh achrei rabim l'ro'os. You have to be careful because it can very well be that the majority prescribes things that are evil and not good. But nevertheless, the governing principle always was and remains achrei rabim lahatos. And the Gemara points out that even one later generation of the Sanhedrin cannot reverse the opinions of the previous generations, unless it is greater in chachma and wisdom. In other words, the second Sanhedrin has within it outstanding personalities that the original Sanhedrin did not have. So even though that may be very hard to judge, but there's a possibility at least that we could agree on that. But what does it mean, b'minyan, with numbers? The numbers are the same. It's the same 70 always. So there's a famous piece in the Ravid who discusses this. The Ravid of Pasquare is the Balasogos against the Rambam. And he says b'minyan means the number of Talmidim that they had. Who had the bigger yeshiva? So b'chochma meant that he's a great Talmid Chacham. And b'minyan meant that he had more Talmidim. He had a greater yeshiva. The numbers were greater. And because of that, therefore, he would have the ability to reverse previous decisions. And he points out that that could be the reason why the Talmud tells us that Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 Talmidim, because the Gemara will conclude that B'kulam Hilchasa Aliba Rabbi Akiva, and everyone we agree that the halacha should be like Rabbi Akiva. It's because Rabbi Akiva had the greatest number of Talmidim. The Gemara said he had 24,000 Talmidim. And there are those that say, for instance, the Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. So Rav had 1,200 Talmidim, the Gemara says. So that was bigger than what Shmuel had, etc., etc. So anyway, we establish that this greatness was on the basis of majority, of numbers. So no, I could not find anyone that said it explicitly. But to me, it seems that it indicates that there was some sort of election, some sort of process where numbers decided who would be the Nasi of the Jewish people, the Nasi of that tribe. And since there would never be a unanimity, no matter how we would strive for it, so therefore the Torah said, Achei Rabim La'atos, whoever gets the most support is the one that should be chosen. So that's another stream. That leadership was chosen by some sort of, I don't know what word to use, democratic, elective, popular process from the people themselves. So we had one shita that was by inheritance, and we had another shita that was because they were the leadership in Egypt, and they just, so to speak, and they earned it. And now we have another shita that it was because of the fact that the majority of the tribe wanted them to be the leaders. There's a fourth stream completely. It says Krue Oeda. There's a Kriya Ksiv later on Krue. They were called. Who called them? So there's an interpretation that, so to speak, they were appointed by heaven. Heaven called them. Heaven told Moshe, this one, this one, this one, this one. On heaven, we can't ask why this one and why not someone else. Because that's on historical Hashem Elokeinu. We never know why. But the mere fact that in heaven, so that's why the parsha begins by Daber Hashem el Moshe b'midbar Sinai le'emor. God told Moshe, these are the Kriyei Oeda, these are the 12 leaders that I want you to take, that they should be the ones that count the Jewish people and lead the Jewish people. The Kabbalah, in the spiritual sense, I learned this from my Rebbe, Rabbi Kreisworth, that when anyone achieves a position of community leadership, first they announce it in heaven, the Kabbalah says. It's like an aliyah. The Gabbai calls you up. What's the source of that? You know, why did he have to call you up? Because that's a public declaration that you're entitled to this aliyah, so to speak. This honor is befitting you. According to many sources, the idea of calling a person up was so that people could object. So you'd say, Yamod, this person, the guy in the back can get up and say, no, he's not entitled. But that's pretty chaotic, but that's pretty Jewish. And so when it came to leadership roles, also, it's an aliyah. In heaven, so to speak, they announced Yamod, so Nachshon ben Aminadab, to head the tribe of Yehuda. And that therefore they are chosen by heaven. And they're chosen by Moshe. And Moshe confirms the choice of heaven here on earth. And that's why it says, "Vayaminu b'Hashem u'b'Moshe avdo." They had to believe Moshe because the whole system is built on who and what Moshe said. It was not built on their own opinions and ideas. And then finally, there's one more extreme idea that the leaders were like called the Olim Gvar, the Gemara says in Bava Basra. There are certain cases, whoever is stronger takes command. So they were the most astute ones. They grabbed it. They were the ones that were able to establish themselves. And that therefore they became the leaders of the Jewish people in the counting here. Now it's noteworthy that everyone that was a leader in the first count no longer was alive for the second count. And the Gemara says for that we see that leadership has a negative side to it. That it's like fire, it can warm, but it can burn. And none of them survived. And when we'll have the story of Korach, we'll see the contentions against the leadership. So it's always a very tricky thing. But the fact that the Torah outlines who the 12 men were is indicative of the fact that somehow there was some sort of system, and that system should govern in the future as well. So we'll discuss maybe tomorrow, how did that system work? What about the Shoftim? What about the Melech? What about in the exile? How did people choose leaders? What was the tradition? And we'll see joyfully that there's no agreement on the subject. Rabbi Chananya ben Akash Omer, Ratzah HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'zakas Yisrael, v'ficha chirba lohem Torah mitzvot shenemar, Adonai chafetz man tzidko yagdil Torah v'yadir.